Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 233 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Theresa, Nicholas Greenaway, Ressa, Night Owl, and Jack Lizoul Nicolini. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Baghead. Baghead was released in 2023. It has 5.4 out of 10 on IMDb and 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. A young woman inherits a rundown pub and discovers a dark secret within its basement. Baghead, a shape-shifting creature that lets one speak to lost loved ones, but not without consequence. Oh, God. I've gotten to this point where I'm like, Stop releasing films that aren't good. You knew this film wasn't good and you released it anyway. Okay, no, sorry. Let's stick to the program. We're going to start with the likes. So, genuinely, I really liked the concept of this film. Right? I really liked the concept. This girl whose father, she's estranged from her father dies. And in the beginning of the film, you have the father in his rundown bar, and this man comes in and he's desperately trying to speak to her. He's like, I need to speak to her. And you're like, oh, intrigued. What's going on here? What's happening? And the father dies, and his estranged daughter is left this bar, this pub. She travels to Berlin, I believe. And she is like, whoa, imagine I've just been bequeathed this crazy old pub. This is wild. And the lawyer's like, maybe you should just get rid of it. And she's like, no, I'm going to keep it. Guess what? There's a ghoul in the basement. There is a hag in the basement. Okay? And you can use that spooky bitch to like contact the dead. You give her a little token of the person who's passed away. She eats it. And then she becomes that person, but you've only got 2 minutes. Right, great, brilliant. What a great concept for a film. Incredibly similar to the film Talk to Me, which I reviewed last year, I think. Incredibly similar in that it is pretty much the very same concept, except in Talk to Me, it's a hand that they use to contact the dead. In this instance, it is a woman affectionately known as Baghead, or a ghoul or an entity or whatever you want to call her. I think Baghead is based on a short story that was released a number of years ago. So I'm pretty sure if I was the makers of Baghead when Talk to Me came out, I would have been like, oh, God damn it. That's really annoying. So in that regard, I kind of felt sorry for the filmmakers of this particular film. But like I said, I really enjoyed the concept because as a viewer, you can absolutely see how this has the potential to go terribly wrong. You know, you have this ability to contact the dead, but not without consequence. Of course, people are going to want to contact the people that they have lost. Of course, they are going to want to do that. And I really do think that this taps into a genuinely interesting conversation about grief that it is important to speak about. You know, there's a level of absolute desperation when it comes to grief. The desperation to speak to that person one more time, to get, you know, to get 60 seconds with that person, to say the things that you want to say. You could totally see how people would become obsessed with speaking to the people that they have lost. And it's a very powerful thing. So in that regard, I think it's a really interesting concept for a film. And I don't think I'd get sick of watching the concept itself, even though the film was so similar in storyline to Talk to Me. I was kind of like, I'm here for it. I'm here for this exploration of grief and the sheer desperation of grief. I am happy to sit and explore that. It's a very, very powerful thing, and it's a very important conversation. And look, the concept of this film is a bit bananas, but also I was like, okay, we're rolling with this. We're doing this. This is fine. But that is where my likes ends. I don't actually have any more likes about this film. So we're going to move swiftly on to the dislikes. I really did not like the script for this film. I thought it was bad. I thought it was predictable. I thought it was cringy. There were multiple moments I found where characters were talking out loud to themselves in a purely expositionary way. The only reason they were doing it was because the filmmakers wanted to make a point clear to the audience. And instead of having it as a conversation between two characters, it was just one character being like, oh, you used to own this pub? While looking at a photograph of a previous owner of the pub. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, oh God, this adds nothing, only cringe factor. Come on, work harder. Come on. And there were moments where like really bizarre things were happening. Like when we first meet Baghead, which is way too early in the film, just as an FYI. We first meet Baghead, this girl who's just inherited this pub, and her best friend are standing there with this random man who's like, there's a monster in the basement, and this creature is crawling out of the walls, clearly some sort of entity from the underworld, and everybody's just standing around being like, wow, well, this is strange. Didn't think this was going to happen. And I just felt, I was watching it going, why is nobody panicking? Because I personally, if I was in that situation, I'd inherited a pub and a creature crawls from the walls, I'd be panicking. Even if I thought that creature was a real woman, I would still be like, there is a woman in the basement of this pub that I've inherited. She does not look well. She does not look well looked after. Was my father imprisoning a woman in the basement of this pub that I've now inherited? Because this is a lot of shit that I have to deal with. No, there was none of that. There was none of that. And look, while we're on the topic, right, I don't know who decided that Baghead was an appropriate name for this film, but it was definitely not the name that I would have gone for. In a list of names for this film, I don't think that would have even made the top 5 for me, to be really frank. And also, Baghead means having a serious drug habit in some places. Although, I mean, I would have a serious drug habit if I was dealing with the morons in this film and the terrible, terrible script of this film. But I really thought Baghead was not a name that I would have gone for in any stretch of the imagination. I mean, she has a literal bag on her head, so I get where the name came from. You know, I get it, but it's just not a good name. And I really did think that the big problem with this film, aside from the terrible script and bizarrely the film feeling like it didn't really have a proper direction, I thought it was badly put together in general. You see Baghead way too early in the film. You see her way too early. And there isn't really anywhere to go after that. And I guess so early on, you see exactly what this entity can do. You see all of the bits that make her creepy. You see all of her powers so early on. You're like, okay, well, I've seen it now. Like, skip to the end, because I don't really need to know anything else. And I read another review that kind of made a really good point about this film, in that they said that it was originally a short film, and I presume a good short film. And when they went to make it into a feature-length film, it was almost like they didn't know how to expand the story, and therefore they ended with a story that was actually pretty weak, and a lot of the characters were fundamentally unlikable. And in the end, I was rooting for Baghead. I felt like she was the most likable character in the whole escapade, to be honest. In my opinion, the whole thing was just very underwhelming. And I just from the beginning, I thought, if you're going to bequeath your daughter something, don't make it the haunted pub that has ruined your life and has a demon living in the basement. Leave her your like collection of DVDs or something. I mean, that is far less soul destroying, literally and figuratively, than a terribly, terribly ghoul infested pub. I don't really know what stars to give this. I think it's a very interesting concept, and it had ideas around diving into the horror of grief. So in a way I was like, yeah, I'm on board with this, until I got bored with this. So I'm going to give it 1.5 stars. That's 1.5 stars for Baghead.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Which brings us to our story this week, or rather should I say stories. Now this week things are going to be a little bit different on our main episode because we have a very special guest. Now some people dislike when guests come on, but it is a one-off. I don't do it very often on main episodes. And today's guest is my wonderful friend Tim. Tim and I have known each other for a very long time, and he has been on Patreon a number of times telling various stories. Tim is a very talented historian and storyteller. I had decided that I was going to release one of his Patreon episodes as like a bonus episode, and I spoke to him about it to make sure that he was okay with me doing that. And then he said, well, you know, I'm happy to come on and do the main episode this week if you want. So I thought, yes, actually, why not? Tim works full time as well. So when he does this, I mean, it's incredible that he puts a huge amount of effort into the research that goes into these episodes. And I absolutely love when he comes on. I also would like to point out that there are very few people in this world that could convince me to drink a beer. And Tim is one of those people. That will make sense when you listen to the episode. Tim has a YouTube channel that is called Mr. Cloak History. Obviously, I will leave the link to everything in the description of this video. But he is a history teacher and he does revision guides, revision videos for GCSE students in England. But obviously, if you are somebody who is just interested in history in its various forms, then there will be videos there for you too that will be of interest. So there's like medicine through time, things like the Vietnam War, civil rights from 1954 to 75, and so on. So there is loads on his YouTube channel for people to dive into. And finally, before we get cracking into the main body of the episode, Tim, to add another string to his ever expanding bow, he also has an Instagram page where he draws famous events in history, and it's pretty amazing. His art is really good, and it's called @DryWipeHistory. And like I said, the links to where you can find all of Tim's stuff will be in the description of this episode. And just to point out as well, this episode is recorded remotely, so the sound is absolutely fine, but it might be a little bit different to the sound that you are used to on these episodes. So this is my heartfelt and absolute thanks to the lovely Tim for preparing all of these stories and for doing so many Patreon episodes over the years and for taking the big brave step to come on and do a main episode. It's very exciting. I'm going to stop rambling now. Let's get cracking. Let's get into the episode and I hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Real Life Ghost Stories. I'm sure I've done some sort of preamble before this that will explain what is happening, but I'm joined in the virtual studio by the wonderful Tim. Tim, who are you? Why are you here?
Hello. Well, first of all, Emma, I'm your friend, aren't I? So that's how we know each other. I used to live in Canterbury with Emma. That's how I got to know her. But I've moved down to Devon now, where I work as a history teacher. And very kindly, Emma sometimes lets me come on and do some historically themed episodes for her Patreon listeners. But this is my first time in this brave new world of the main episode.
I know, it feels like a massive step, doesn't it? It's like, oh, I'm unleashing you into the wild.
I know. I've seen some of the names that have preceded me, and I'm starting to think, you do realise I am just basically a bloke who teaches history in Devon. But hey, people have been very kind about my stories in the past, so hopefully the listeners will love what I've got to tell you today.
You are absolutely doing yourself a disservice there, because people adore your stories. They love it when you come on to tell stories. And also, just to be clear, Tim is like, Emma sometimes lets me do stories on the Patreon. Tim is a great storyteller, puts a huge amount of effort and research into these stories, and is an all-round wonderful person. When I said earlier about, like, I'm sure I've done a preamble, I have done a preamble where I've said all this before. So the first sort of, opening 5 minutes of this has just been me being like, Tim is great and he does loads of research and he works full time. And I just need you to know how much work he puts into this.
It was a bit of a surprise to me because I looked back through the back catalogue, if you like. I think this is the 11th or 12th episode I've done with you.
Yeah.
So double figures now. That's quite a bit, isn't it?
That is a lot. I was thinking about it today too, because I was sent out on a special mission by Tim before this episode, which we will get into later. And when I was on my mission, I was thinking about how many episodes we had done. And I was like, oh, it's definitely like 7 or 8. But yeah 11 or 12 seems,
And the thing is, the way I try and do things is, as a historian, I try and give the historical context to what we're looking at. So I love a ghost story where there's a real bit of history that you can hook it onto. I think it adds so much credibility to it. And I think that the historical stories really go with it. So I'm really hoping that everyone enjoys that today as well. But we've done all sorts of diverse things. We've done talks about my walks around Dartmoor and the folklore there. We've done pixie folklore, or piskies as they're known down here in Devon. We've looked at ghosts on the railways and in aviation, but we got something a little bit different to do today, haven't we?
Yes, we do. Now, all I know, just for context for the listeners, the only thing I know about this episode is the title. That's all I know. So I know roughly what this episode is about, but I have no idea what stories Tim has researched or put together. So I'm hearing all this for the first time, just as you are.
Well, also pressure on me to get it right, hey?
Yeah, no pressure, babe, no pressure.
Well, shall we get into my introduction then, where I can lay out what we're going to be looking at today?
Yeah, let's get into it.
I'll go on to today's title, which is Beers, Wines and Spirits, Ghosts of the English Village Pub. Anyone who knows me knows that I love a traditional pub. My favourite ones tend to have roaring fires, sleeping dogs, a selection of traditional ales, and centuries of history. The more crooked the door, the better. The more likely I am to give myself a significant head injury on a low beam, the better too. In summer, I love a pint of beer in the beer garden with friends. No, dear listeners, English ale isn't really warm. Kept right, it's as cool as the deep cellar in which it's kept, full of flavour and with a mild fizz. It comes in as many varieties as there are names for pubs, and speaking of which, the odd names of English pubs date back to a pre-literate age when public houses and alehouses would advertise their presence with a distinctive image on a sign outside. It might be the royal coat of arms or a picture of the then monarch for the king's arms or the king's head. It could be an animal like a black horse or a red lion. It might be something utterly nonsensical like an elephant and castle or a bull and dragon. Whatever the name, generations of people have looked forward to a chat and a drink in their local. While pub numbers and patronage decline, and increasingly they evolve away from old-fashioned boozers to include quality food, for centuries they were the centre of social life in the village. Is it any wonder that some of these ancient, long-dead drinkers are reluctant to leave, even when last orders has been called on their very life? In previous episodes, this admitted skeptic, me, has confessed to witnessing odd things late at night in his local pubs. The much-missed Black Horse in my hometown has twice left me speechless. Once when a glass flew off the shelf onto a tiled floor with a loud donk, but did not break. And then another time, only last year, when I saw the colourless reflection of a woman in the window of a closed door. Electricians working in that pub behind the bar have complained of shadows lingering by them, as if inspecting their work. Various landlords over the years have told of footsteps upstairs and opening doors. One or two terrified guests even woke to the sight of a royalist cavalier soldier standing by their bed, witnesses reporting a finger missing on one hand, A very curious coincidence at best. At another pub, formerly a townhouse and a hotel, I have stopped mid-conversation as a friend and I have both heard someone clear their throat, as if to get our attention, only to see that there was no one else at the bar, not even the staff. When the barmaid turned up again and we asked her who was still here in the pub, she just nonchalantly replied, "Oh, you heard someone coughing, right? Yeah, happens all the time. I saw a shadow on the CCTV screen earlier whilst locking up. I just ignore it." Surely these things can't all be attributed to the admitted potency of West Country cider. In today's stories, I have tried to avoid the most famous haunted pub stories. I won't be reminding you of the Ancient Ram, the Jamaica Inn, or York's Golden Fleece, as engaging as those stories are. You've probably heard them all before. Instead, I've gone for the smaller, more remote village pubs. In fact, let's be specific about my criteria now. I've made this much more difficult than I need to have done. The pub that I'm going to talk about must be English, the pub must be in a village, and it must be a pub that I've actually been to. Yes, this will likely give these stories a distinct bias towards places where I have lived, but to me, authenticity matters. These will be the kinds of stories that landlords and landladies delight in telling as they polish glasses in the cosy low light of the snug. The kinds of stories told by locals as they perch on bar stools or ruffle their old dog's fur as they join in overheard conversations. The kinds of stories that all too often start with the words, "I don't believe in ghosts, but..." So pull up a chair by the fire, take a sip of your pint of best bitter, and drink in your measure of spirits of a different kind.
Yeah! I was cheering during your introduction. I was watching you. I'm where you couldn't see me. I was muted, but I had my fist in the air. I was like, "Go on, Tim, what an introduction."
Well, we are going to shamelessly rip off another podcast now, though, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
So at this point, when I've said take a sip of your pint of best bitter, I've made a request and I've sent you out to the shops, haven't I?
Yes. So I would like to caveat this by saying that I generally don't drink. I'm partial to a margarita every now and then, but I don't drink, and I especially do not drink beer. And I feel like Tim is probably the only person in the world, aside from Nick Gordon, that could convince me to buy and drink a beer.
So this is for experimental purposes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not expecting you to finish it if you really do hate it. But I've sent you out to get the most ridiculous sounding beer that you could get. Because one of the wonderful things about English ales is every region has got their own flavours and varieties and different styles. And so I've gone for some Devon beers, of which I'm going to give you a choice out of 3. And then I'll probably only just have one. Otherwise, I won't be able to finish this episode. And then you can tell me what you've got and we'll see what we think of them. Okay. After all, we met at a pub, didn't we?
Yes, we did. A pub called the Duck and Bastard.
Yes, we met at the Duck and Bastard, which is underneath my stairs, which typically isn't, strictly speaking, a licensed premises, is it? But then we also used to go to socials at the Unicorn in Canterbury and the Monument. I mean, you don't have to be a drinker to love a pub. They've just got an atmosphere all their own, haven't they?
No, that is true. And as somebody who doesn't drink and spends a lot of time in the pub, I love a pub. It's such a gorgeous social occasion. It's lovely to sit around a table and just chat. Yeah. I find pubs to be very comforting and very cathartic and very therapeutic, even as a non-drinker.
And there's a pub for everyone, isn't there? If you don't like a pub that you go into, just leave. There'll be another 1, 2, or even 10 down the road that you'll absolutely love. So who's going to go first with their bottle?
I think you should go first.
Right, I'm going to give you a choice here. Now, Emma can see this on the webcam, but I'm going to tell you what the names of them are. We have one which is from Exeter. This one's called Avocet, named after a very long-billed wading bird.
I do like a bird, so that's a good start.
That's a good start. We've got one which is called Devon Dumpling. Oh, I'm holding it away from the camera.
That's really cute.
So there's Devon Dumpling, which, I mean, could be a pet name for me, perhaps. And one harking back to the first episode I ever did with you and Dan, which is Dartmoor IPA. So the famous IPA style, but given a Dartmoor twist. What are we going to go for?
I'm really tied between all of them, actually. But I think it has to be the Dartmoor IPA, because the first episode you ever did on Patreon was all about your trekking around Dartmoor on your own. And I think it's fitting to have a Dartmoor IPA.
Let's go for it then. So there's going to be a certain amount of ASMR content now as I open the bottle and pour it into my D&B Duck and Bastard themed handle glass here. And I'd love to know what you've picked up from the shops. Emma, what have you gone for?
So for context, I had to pick mine up from Tesco's because I was on a time limit today, and I was also post rehearsal. I had an early morning rehearsal, and then when the rehearsal was finished, I went straight into town in a full tracksuit, wearing a fur coat
This is a great look.
and a pair of Crocs that are covered in ridiculous gibbets. So I looked absurd, which I often do, so that's not really a problem.
It's not a problem.
But it is the first time I think I've ever gone into a shop and bought a bottle of beer. And I thought to myself, I was buying this individual bottle of beer, nothing else. And I was in a full tracksuit, a fur coat, and some Crocs. And honestly, I never felt like more of a lad.
This is excellent. I'm not going to make you down it or anything.
Oh, I think I might down it anyway because
Just
I
make a
feel
point.
so empowered. So I went for I took some time over what I was going to get.
Good.
And
Good.
one of the options was an IPA called Life or Death, which I thought was fitting with the theme.
That's very fitting.
Yes. But I did instead go for a ghost ship.
Oh, Adnams. Excellent brewery and a very good choice.
An Adnams Ghost Ship, which is described as a hauntingly good beer. And it has bold citrus flavors from citra hops. I have no idea what that means. So
Yeah, they just sort of got a slight kind of lemony taste to them. They're good though. They are good.
yeah, but that's
I used to drink that stuff.
decided that Ghost Ship was the way to go.
Well, I used to drink that stuff in the Lady Luck in Canterbury when I lived there, and it always went down very well. I think actually you've chosen well. If you're ever going to like a beer, it would probably be one like that because it's not overly bitter. You're still probably going to hate it though, aren't you?
Yeah, probably. I did consider getting, there was one that was like a raspberry and vanilla ripple beer, which I very
really
much
risk.
considered getting because I was like, this feels like I might be able to drink it, but I decided instead to go for the Ghost Ship, which says, inspired by the tales of old smuggling ships along the Suffolk coast, this hauntingly good pale ale is full of citrus and biscuit aromas with a spookily hoppy bite. What's spookily hoppy mean? What does that mean?
I think it'd be fairly spooky if you can taste any biscuit in there, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I might as well read mine now since you've done the same. So it says on mine, Dartmoor IPA is a highly drinkable, which is helpful, light golden pale ale with a unique blend of English and Australian hops, creating a subtle tropical and grapefruit flavour. Dartmoor Brewery is the highest brewery in England, situated at 1,465 feet above sea level in the heart of the beautiful National Park of Dartmoor. And I've seen it. The brewery is in Princetown, just behind where I park my car when I go on my walks. So that's a nice little bit of symmetry there, I suppose.
I'm going to do some ASMR. You ready?
Okay, let's hear it. Ooh, good technique.
Oh, it's not going well. Oh, I could barely get the top of it.
This is your first rodeo, isn't it?
This is my first rodeo. I hope the microphone picks that up. Okay. I have to say, Australia is not what I think of when I think of Dartmoor.
No, it isn't. But I suppose the IPA style, the India Pale Ale, they're originally brewed with lots of hops at a higher strength so that the beer could make the journey to India during the time of the British Empire without going off. But these days they tend to make them a lot weaker, and it just means a hoppy pale ale, basically. So shall we tuck in?
Yes, we shall.
Well, you poured that very quickly, didn't you?
Well, yes, I did. I've got and I'm glad nobody can see me because I've got a giant head on my beer. What does yours smell like?
It smells like beer, really.
Yeah, mine too. It doesn't. It just smells like I'm not going to like it.
This is not going to be like. I never think that smelling beer is too much of a good idea if you don't like beer. Mine smells sort of fruity, I suppose. It's got a slight citrus smell to it. But anyway, I'm going to get stuck in. I mean, I knew it was going to be good because I've had this beer so many times before. But that is lovely.
It's not offensive.
That's better than I could have hoped for.
Yes. So you're right. I see what you mean. If you're going to enjoy, if you're going to try a beer and not hate it, this is one that's worth trying. It's not as I'm trying to think of a good word. It's not as bitter as I find beer to be. No.
You got a nice light one there.
Yes, which I'd like to think is because I chose a light one, not
you
just
made
because
an informed decision as a consumer there, didn't you?
Yeah, no, I went for the name and the name alone. But it's not, I mean, I wouldn't be rushing out to ever drink a beer again, but
I
it's
mean,
not offensive.
if you can try and sip a couple more bits, you never know, it might even get better.
It
As
might
for
grow on
mine,
me.
I mean, I didn't need all that blurb on the back of the bottle. I would just say it's a pale ale that's quite hoppy. There you go. That's all you need to know about it. But what people who aren't used to English beers might not realise, though, is they're not that fizzy. And I quite like that fact because you don't feel all kind of gassy and bloated when you're drinking it. You just sip away and enjoy, usually with good company. And I think in this case, we can count you as good company as well, I'm glad to say. And some good stories. And
I
so,
like a fizz, I have to say.
it
Just
can be
as an
quite
aside.
refreshing. But I just can't.
Yeah.
I can't have too much of it personally.
No, I get that. But it's fine. I've just had another sip by choice.
Is it growing on you at all?
No.
Keep trying.
I'll keep trying. Who knows? Maybe by the end of the bottle I'll be like, my God, that tastes very Moorish.
I've changed your life. Yeah. That could well be it. Moorish beer. It could be what we're going for. I mean, you should have gone for mine. It said it was very drinkable, which is, I think, as a baseline for what you expect of a drink, that's as much as it says, really. However, shall we get into some spooky stories?
Let's get into some stories. I'm excited.
Now, remember, I set myself the difficult criteria of making sure that these were English pubs in villages, so none in towns and cities, and they all had to be ones that I've been to. Now, the last time I spoke to you, Emma, on an episode, I said that in about 3 hours' time, I was actually going to one of the pubs I was going to mention today, and we're going to kick off with that very pub. I should point out that although some of these might sound a little bit like reviews for these pubs, I've not been paid anything for this at all. This is not affiliated with any sort of tourist board. These are just genuinely pubs I've been to and I've loved that have ghost stories attached to them. So who knows? They've got a bit of free advertising here. They've got to be grateful for that. Our first stories come from one of my favourite local pubs, the Coach and Horses in Buckland Brewer, North Devon. It's one of the oldest pubs in the country and possibly even predates the church in the village. Established sometime in the 13th century, it has had several uses in addition to a pub in its almost 800 years of existence. When one enters to the cosy main bar, one is struck, sometimes quite literally, by the low beams of the ceiling, warped by age and still showing the ancient axe marks of the medieval carpenters. No sooner have you stooped through the door than Ollie the landlord brightly welcomes you with a "What can I get you folks?" and offers to put the cricket on the telly or a log on the fire. Oh, and the chips are the best I've ever had in any pub, full stop. Anyway, I digress. With its thick cob walls and high thatched roof, it is the picture-perfect country pub, but allegedly with a somewhat turbulent past. Rebuilt several times over the centuries, the low ceiling suggests that in an early guise it perhaps lacked the upper floor, instead likely being a hall open to the rafters. Such a building would have been used as a courthouse and a meeting place as well as a pub. In the 17th century, this part of the world was staunchly royalist, as England was riven apart by civil war. It is likely that, as with the case of the Black Horse in nearby Torrington, the pub would have been garrisoned with soldiers, or more likely officers, of the army of King Charles I, fighting the armies of Parliament. The mantelpiece today has a small cannonball mounted in a brass stand, found locally, and likely a relic of this time. Attached to one of the beams in the pub is a large, hand-forged iron hook. Normally, such hooks are where the pub would hang game animals ready to be made into pies and stews for hungry patrons, but this one is bigger than that, and reputedly it had a darker purpose. It is said that at this time trials and even executions were carried out here. Condemned men would be hanged from the hook by their arms in an agonising and slow death, or otherwise kept here awaiting the hanging by neck until dead. Indeed, the cellar, now cool and perfect for keeping local ales and ciders, was adapted into a jail. More gruesome still, the ceiling above the bar was once converted into a hangman's drop. Knowing this makes one stoop all the lower on entering. In the same room as the now blocked trapdoor, 2 cavalier officers have often been seen facing the hook. Are they watching or guarding a condemned man? Or are they discussing the latest reversals against their army as Fairfax's new model army advanced from Exeter to Torrington? But the ghostly occurrences don't end with these 2 royalist officers. It seems the armies of Parliament may have advanced through the village and taken possession of the pub, as in one of the guest rooms a parliamentarian soldier, complete with distinctive lobster-tail cavalry helmet, has been seen as well. There are no reports as to whether the Cavaliers and Roundhead soldiers continue their fight from beyond the grave, however. Despite its undoubtedly cosy atmosphere, one shivers at the thought of the woman dressed in mourning black who walks sorrowfully in the upstairs corridors, only to disappear before she can be approached. So what are my recommendations for this haunted pub of North Devon? Well, I'd go for this. Grab the table by the fire with the cannonball on the mantelpiece. Have the deep-fried brie as a starter. Treat yourself to a pint of Golden Pig Pale Ale. And try not to think of the hangman's noose that once hung through a trapdoor over the bar.
The idea of hanging somebody by their arms for, an extended period of time or until they were dead is absolutely barbaric.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
I know that in years gone by, me and you always talk about this, that you can't judge past actions by modern sensibilities, right? Because we're like, how could they do that? But my word.
Even for them, that was pretty extreme. I mean, it was quite deliberately almost an imitation of crucifixion. So they would have had a real understanding of that.
Yes. And I can't even imagine the pain and the suffering. And anyway, I could go on about it all day.
Yeah.
But it is amazing that you have these little pubs. Like this was, you said, the oldest pub in the village, and potentially even is older than the church.
Yeah, I mean, the church was probably there before it, but the existing church building that's there now is a good 200 years more recent than this pub building.
It's amazing that, the pub was given such importance, even in small villages, even back then, as a meeting place, as a, as a place where you could go and get fed, and you could probably do lots of wheeling and dealing in the pub and all of those things. And I do think it's amazing the importance that the pub had even in small villages back in those days.
If you're wondering where I got these stories, well, my opening moves here were just simply talking to the landlord. And when you get to know a friendly landlord, when you get on first names terms, it's great sometimes to just say, come on then, have you got any ghost stories? Because almost always when I speak to a landlord who's in a really old pub and say, have you got any ghost stories? A lot of the time they'll say, oh, absolutely. And they'll enthusiastically tell you all about them. They kind of know as well that can be quite a tempting thing to get people through the door. But even those who are a little bit less enthusiastic will often just go, well, yeah, strange things do happen. I don't really think about it. And they might be quite casual about it. But when I spoke to Ollie about this, he's seen the woman upstairs. His daughter has also seen the woman in black upstairs going around the corners. She's not a threatening presence, apparently. It's just a bit weird when you're not used to it. And then eventually you kind of get used to it, as you do when you move into a new house and you're moving around and you get used to the creaks and the different lights and shadows that form in that house. She's just a part of it. The bit I find so much more alarming, though, is that sense of having the hangman's drop over the bar. Obviously, this place wasn't a pub for a long time, but when you've got such awful darkness and those heights of emotions that would have been there as people were sentenced to death, for example, when it was being used as a courthouse, is it any wonder that there's some sort of energy that's left behind there? Because the pub itself is cozy as you like. It could not be a more cozy pub. It's ridiculously low ceilinged. I'm 6'2", and I genuinely can't stand up in there at all. And it's so cozy, and yet it's got this horrible dark history as well. And I do wonder what it would be like once all the lights are off at night and you just sat there in the quiet. I imagine your mind would start seeing things, wouldn't it?
Oh, definitely, especially if you know the history that at one point, like you said, this was a courthouse. This was a place where people were sentenced to literal death. Like the amount of emotional turmoil that would have gone on there is pretty staggering. And
I mentioned as well the English Civil War in there. For listeners who don't know about it, England's Civil War was between 1642 and 1649. Or, well, the first one was anyway. And it even resulted in the execution of our king, Charles I, in Parliament won. It's one of the reasons why democracy in Britain exists today, because Parliament did win that fight. But it genuinely tore the country apart. In the same way that the American Civil War pit states against states, this was even more divisive in the sense that it turned members of the same family against each other. We have plenty of records of father fighting son. And so the emotions attached to that must have been absolutely shocking as well. But this part of the world in North Devon was very, very royalist, absolutely backed Charles I. And so they backed the losing cause. And you do wonder as well how much of that energy would be tied up in these sorts of places. Because it must have been a dreadful time, an absolutely dreadful time. Indeed, we think about the world wars and how dreadful they were. Proportionally, the English Civil War is the most destructive and deadly war in British history. And English Civil War is not a good term for it, really, because there was plenty of fighting on the borders of Wales involving Scotland and, of course, involving Ireland.
And like you said, whole families that were driven apart.
And that's reflected within the ghosts here. You have distinctively royalist-looking ghosts and distinctively parliamentarian-looking ghosts. The division was that substantial that in a time before military uniforms, you could tell often one side from another from how they dressed and the sort of cultures and manners that they were adopting. So, bit of a darkness to that one there, but a very cosy pub. The next one I've got for you is much more related to folklore, though. And we always love a bit of devil lore, don't we?
Yes, I love a bit of devil lore.
Should we get into the next one?
Yes.
All right. Well, our next pub isn't too far away from the last. It's in the hilltop village of Shebbeare, also in North Devon. For over 4 centuries, travelling folk have rested and slaked their thirst at the Devil's Stone Inn. But what of this name? Well, on the green opposite, near to the old schoolhouse and the neat lich gate of St Michael's Church, lies a boulder, and next to that, a partially bare patch of discoloured grass. English towns and cities reverberate to the sound of fireworks and revelry each November the 5th, as bonfires and effigies commemorate the foiling of Guy Fawkes and the Catholic plot to blow up King James I and Parliament. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Or so the rhyme goes. But in Shebbeare, the people gather for a very different reason. It is said that centuries ago, the devil himself appeared on the village green, hoping to tempt the good people of the parish into sin. His plot was foiled when St Michael himself, defending the church of which he was patron, miraculously dropped the granite boulder onto the devil, crushing him and sending him back into the abyss. Certainly, the rock is incongruous, a granite mass where no other similar stones can be found. But with this deliverance came a superstition. The devil cursed the village to damnation and eternal misfortune in revenge for his defeat. But the wily folk of Devonshire are not so easily scared. They vowed that every November the 5th they would join together and turn over the stone and trap the devil in hell for another year. So determined are these people to keep Beelzebub at bay that even as England entered another lockdown in November 2020, 2 men with a wooden plank turned the stone as the rest of the village watched on, either from their windows or at a socially distant space. Naysayers will tell you that the rock was dropped by a glacier in the last ice age. That may be. But has anyone seen the devil in Shebbeare any time lately? The answer is no, and so the stone turning goes on. But as for the inn that bears the name of the Devil's Stone, it seems that place is far from spiritually deserted. Originally built as a farmhouse, handsome stone walls and having burnt down and been rebuilt at least once in its eventful history, the pub sits on the village square outside and opposite St Michael's Church. On entering, one is struck by the rabbit warren-like layout. I once nipped to the gents after an elegant sufficiency of Dartmoor Legend Ale and was lost for 6 to 7 days, or so it felt. The beer garden looks out over the Devonian hills, and patrons are often joined by inquisitive goats from the farm over the hedge. The inn retains its guest rooms, popular with tourists and ghosts alike. One repeated tale involves guests in the upper rooms hearing little footsteps running down the corridor. Others have heard giggles and turned around to see the cheeky face of a small girl darting back around the corner as if playing hide and seek. She is described as wearing a white nightdress, and her appearances are often accompanied by the smell of smoke, despite the fires upstairs not being in use. Is it possible that this is a little girl who is thought to have died when the original farmhouse burned down? Other guests have spoken to an empty chair at the bar or apologise as they've brushed past it. They swear that it wasn't empty at all, and that a grumpy-looking man with a grey beard is sitting there looking disapprovingly but not malevolently at them, only to find that nobody else at the bar can see him. Most pubs have at least one grumpy but harmless old local. It seems this one just doesn't want to call time on his trip to the boozer. At the same time, but less frequently reported, is the spectre of a Second World War airman in a smart blue uniform, waiting patiently to order a drink that will never come. Certainly an inn like this would have had airmen on leave visiting as they made their way back to coastal air bases, who often sadly fell foul of the treacherous southwest weather and hills or succumbed to the withering fire of U-boats and ships that they attacked. This man, though, seems to be the echo of that traumatic time, but one suggestion is that he died unexpectedly in one of the guest rooms, rather than dying in action. Perhaps most distinctively, the owners and several guests over the years have seen a man in a big red coat, wearing a tri-corner hat. He's been seen in one of the dining rooms. Such a character would make sense, this being the typical attire for an 18th century coachman, and they would have regularly frequented the old inn as they conveyed people on the roads through to Cornwall and South Devon. He doesn't speak or interact, but is apparently distinct and in full colour, rather than being misty or colourless. Other activity seems more poltergeist-like in nature. Taps are turned on, and lights switched on and off. Doors and windows are flung open and pictures tossed from the walls. While this may be a result of the strange gusts of wind and air pressure in such an old maze-like building, guests in room 8 are well advised to wrap up warm. Some have reported having the bedsheets whipped off of them in the middle of the night, and housekeeping sometimes have to remake the bed when guests complain that the room hadn't been prepared, when in truth it had been. Despite the fright that this spirit gives, the current owners, Lee and Susie, insist there isn't anything nasty about any of their paranormal guests. They're just a part of the building, and a part of its charm. My recommendation? A pint of Dartmoor Jail Ale, and a very retro-style prawn cocktail in the beer garden. And if the bar seems busy with people waiting to be served, it might well be worth asking if the staff can see them there too.
God, you can't go wrong with a prawn cocktail though, can you?
You really can't. Oh, it's just so refreshing.
I just love a prawn cocktail. And I want, like you just said, I want a retro prawn cocktail.
Yeah.
Like I don't want it to be deconstructed. I don't want it to be anything newfangled. I want a retro prawn cocktail.
You know those glass bowls that you get with a stem on them that everyone's mum and dad seem to have? They're served in those. So you really can't go wrong. It's the perfect thing.
Prawn cocktail is also really good with mango.
Is it?
Yes. If you add a mango to your prawn cocktail, it is very good. This is such like cricket commentary talk.
That makes sense to me.
I love devil folklore.
Oh, it's great, isn't it?
I just love it. I love how much devil folklore there is. And I love how sort of easily vanquished the devil seems to be in all of this folklore. You know, I know
he should be beaten.
But St. Michael, obviously, Archangel Michael, bopping down, dropping a boulder on the devil. Brilliant. Yeah. We love that. And then the townspeople are like, fuck it, if we just turn it over every year, do you think that'll keep him down there? And then they're like, yeah, well, have you seen the devil around? No. So obviously it's working. Love it.
Okay. That is proof, isn't it? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Works. And I love the fact that the Devil Sewn In is so named after it. Because you go up there, you see the sign on the outside. There's a picture of the devil being crushed by a stone. Because of course it is.
Obviously.
And it's a beautiful village as well. I mean, I'm biased because this is where I'm from. This is home to me. But the rolling hills and the green, if you were to picture an English village as you might see it on TV or in a film, this is genuinely what these places are like.
Yeah.
I'll keep on saying this to you, Emma, but when are you coming down to visit? I'll take you to all of these places.
Never. No, I will be coming down. I just have to get my devil fighting gear in tow, and then I'll be ready to go. Do you know?
The people of Sheffield have got you covered. Don't worry about it.
It's fine. I'll be there front row, ready to rock and roll with the devil. I love devil folklore, and I love how much of a big part of English folklore devil folklore is. You know, we've talked on Patreon numerous times about churches who have the devil attached to them, where the devil is trapped, or he's, you know, underneath the church, or underneath a stone, or whatever it is, or in the basement. And I think it's really fascinating that so much devil folklore exists, and in this instance is still recognized to this day. That's the really nice thing about this one in particular.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that it's the origin of a really charming local tradition, and let's face it, just an excuse for everyone to go out and party and go to the pub, it's just all the better, isn't it?
Who doesn't want an excuse to go out and party and go to the pub and have a big celebration and have everybody get together? I love it.
I couldn't agree more. The thing is, though, both of the pubs and stories that I've told you so far have been down my neck of the woods, down here in Devon.
Yes.
I thought it was only fair for us to come back to Kent for you next.
Oh, I hope this is a pub that I've been in.
I'm not sure it will be, because I've actually only been in this one a couple of times, but it's a really interesting one. And so if you've not been to it, Emma, it's not far away from you. I think it's worth the journey. But maybe you have been to it. We'll see. As I've already hinted at, our next pub is over at the other end of the country, in the historic county of Kent. In centuries past, the market town of Faversham was a major port, but the river gradually silted up until only small barges could use it. Nevertheless, Faversham Creek still has a variety of modern and historic vessels based there. Kent is often called the Garden of England, and its countryside is covered by orchards and hop fields. Faversham itself honours the hop-picking tradition with an annual festival of folk music and local beers at the Hop Festival, harking back to the celebrations as the hop harvest was completed. Revellers go from pub to pub with hop flowers in their hair, enjoying the best of the late summer sun, one of the biggest traditional brewers in the country, Shepherd Neame, has brewed ales in the town since 1698 and is still going strong. On certain days, the inviting, sweet smell of malting barley wafts through the streets, which I remember well when I worked there. But did I not say that these stories were all about village pubs? It so happens that Shepherd Neame not only makes the beer, but also owns many of the pubs. While they do a marvellous job of keeping them viable, they can all become a little bit similar. And while Shepherd Neame beers are delicious, having no choice other than Sheps can be a little limiting to the discerning pubgoer. This is why it might be worth the journey of travelling out through the lanes and the marshes north of the town of Faversham to a small village, or rather a hamlet, that of Hollowshaw. There, gleaming in white-painted timber cladding, is the historic Shipwrights Arms. On entering, one is greeted by a generous central brick hearth and wood panelling. Unsurprisingly, maritime paraphernalia fill every nook and shelf of the building, with fading photographs of elegant sailing vessels and steely-eyed bearded mariners staring back at you. Dating at least since the early 1700s and located right on the coast, it is no surprise that tales of smugglers and revenue men abound. Little doubt, too, of the stories of weary sailors who might take a room for the night and who, for a few shillings more, could perhaps have some company into the bargain. But the haunted history of this quirky free house, i.e. not attached to any particular brewery and therefore free to stock whatever beer they like, concerns a tragic incident in the 19th century. One stormy night, very late, and well after the landlord had bolted the door to keep out intruders, there came a great hammering at the door. The landlord shouted that they were closed, fearful of the unseen visitor. The hammering carried on, accompanied by shouting now and swearing and demands to be let in. The landlord, fearful, refused and retreated back inside, and eventually the hammering abated. As dawn broke, the landlord opened the door and reeled back in horror. There on the step, soaked through and wearing a sealskin coat and peaked cap, was the body of a man who had knocked on the door, apparently dead from hypothermia and exposure. That night a small ship had foundered on the mudflats, and this man, the captain, had been, or perhaps should have been, the only survivor. Racked with guilt, the landlord could only arrange for the unfortunate mariner to be taken away for burial nearby. However, in the almost 200 years since, the spirit of the sea captain has not given up finding hospitality in the pub. On stormy nights, landlords and landladies down the ages have again been awoken by the frantic hammering on the front door. Often, the door is opened to reveal that there is nobody there. At other times, drinkers have noted a sudden chill in the air, and the pungent reek of rum, ship's tar, and tobacco fills the air. However, sometimes this spirit manifests in such a way to be visible. He walks in heavily towards the bar, dripping wet, only to disappear before people's very eyes. One landlady some years ago awoke horrified to find him staring at her from the foot of her bed, eyes reddened from the salt water and clothes still dripping wet, only for him to disappear once more. Perhaps the most alarming story, though, is that of a former landlord's son who awoke in the middle of the night to find the bearded, salt-crusted face of the captain resting on the pillow in bed next to him. Coastal pubs are no strangers to old mariners, with a life at sea etched into the deep creases of their faces. But this character is perhaps one to avoid. My recommendation? A pint of Old Dairy Blue Top Ale and a seat near to the door. Booking early is advisable to avoid disappointment and to avoid being left out on the step all evening.
The thought of waking up
with
a fucking sea captain on the pillow next to you, an old-timey sea captain.
Hello, Captain Birdseye. Just know.
Can you imagine? I'd be like, please, dear Lord, let me be dreaming, because I'm not dealing with this.
Is this where we have to have another conversation about spirits and consent and personal space?
Yes, we do, Tim, because, I feel very strongly about consent and personal space, even in the afterlife.
It's important. I mean, admittedly, when these inns were in operation, it was absolutely normal to share a bed with a complete stranger. It just was.
Was it actually?
Did you not know that?
No.
No, so medieval inns and into the kind of early modern period, you paid for the room, you didn't pay for an individual bed. So often you would just hop in to where someone else had just got out and it was still warm, and you just sort of say, evening, and then you just get next to the person who was already there. Absolutely true. You would be paying extra for a private room. The face you're pulling right now.
I am shocked. I'm shocked, but I'm not shocked, because I can't imagine doing that now. Like, I just can't imagine it. I have seen people though who have booked, seats on, 24-hour bus journeys in various parts of the world where you book a double bed and guess what? There's somebody already in it and you have to
Yeah.
share that bed with that person for 24 hours. So I'm not in disbelief that it happened and that it happens, but I just can't imagine it.
Is it any wonder they needed a drink before heading to bed?
Oh my God, is it any wonder they needed a drink? Is right. And then you don't know if that person is alive or the ghost of an angry sea captain.
Which is, to be fair, I think he's got a point, this sea captain, though. I
I
don't
do
condone
too,
the getting into bed, but the hammering on the door when you know you're next to an area which suffers from shipwrecks, that landlord, I mean, he must have suffered with guilt for the rest of his days. He absolutely must have done. But you'd have thought that they would have let someone in if they sounded that desperate. I mean, in times since, we know that the Coast Guard has used this pub in the upper rooms there as a lookout. So it's got a connection to the safety at sea as well. But the idea that this man wasn't let in on this one tragic occasion, it cost him his life. I'd be going back demanding a free pint as well, to be fair. I really would.
Oh, yeah. I'd be going back for all eternity shitting people up in that pub. Absolutely. I will hold a grudge. Happily.
I think we should have a little pilgrimage over there next time I'm.
I think so too.
Because it's not that far away. It's I suppose it's probably 2-3 mile walk from the station if we wanted to get the train there, so we could, have a drink while we get there. Or if someone fancies driving, it's not too far either. It's just down the end of the little lanes that go through the salt marshes and the flats north of Faversham. I mean, we both know the area so well, don't we? I used to teach in Faversham before I moved down here for a different job. It's a wonderful little town, but these little villages that are around the outside, most of them have got their own pubs, and this one is an absolute belter. I've been there, I think, twice, but it's a really good one.
And what a great story. And it do you know what it feels to me when I was listening to you and I was writing my notes, while also admittedly doodling, because there's a mix of both on my notes. I was thinking about the telltale heart. That's what it reminded me of, that banging on the door being the guilt of the landlord, echoing through eternity. I very much had Edgar Allan Poe vibes.
It totally does, doesn't it? But this spirit here actually seems to be sentient. It seems to know what it's doing and interact with people as well. But to be honest, that there's that mind's eye image that I've got of his reddened eyes and his furious features. There's that look of a 19th century mariner, isn't there, with the creased face and just the world weariness of them. I mean, they probably looked about 60 when they were 30, didn't they? But
definitely.
What a life.
What a life is right. They just lived such a grim existence that was so weather beaten and full of labor and hardship. And then somebody doesn't even open the door for you when you're dying. Oh, listen.
Talk about adding insult to injury, or perhaps salt in the wound would be a better phrase there.
Oh, I think he's going to haunt you for that one.
I think he might do. Yeah, that was possibly a mistake. Maybe I'll go in disguise next time. Look, though, this is the thing, though. You're talking about all this hard labour that people are doing. People were doing back-breaking stuff back then. A trip to the pub was as much a part of your diet as anything else. I mean, the calories that you get in beer was such an important component of what you had within the day. That is, again, it's something that we've sort of lost now, isn't it?
I really think it is. That actual, the lifeline, literally, and kind of figuratively, that the pub was for the people in that village. I don't know if this might be not a true fact. So you with your historical brain can correct me. Wasn't there a point in history where in England in particular, people drank beer more so than water or anything else because it was safer?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. It's been a little bit corrupted. Most villages had a pretty safe water source as well. The problems with drinking water really start to crop up in towns. So it's certainly true in medieval towns. It's definitely true in the towns of the Industrial Revolution. You know what? Funny enough, I'm not going to get too much into that because that does crop up in one of our later stories.
Oh, okay.
It absolutely does. But what you do have is this sense of beer being liquid bread. It was much more treated as part of your food intake than it was part of your drink, if you like, because of the calories within it, because of the fact that you needed it. So certain varieties of beer were actually brewed to be more calorific, things like porter and stout. Porter in the sense that porters have to do a lot of heavy lifting and carrying. They need the extra calories of that thick, dark beer to get them through the working day. But also the fact that beer was brewed in such a variety of strengths. You had small beer, for example, which might only be 0.5% or 1%. You'd literally give that to the kids because it would give them calories and it wouldn't get them drunk or anything. Our attitude towards beer as a drink has really changed. And you got this divide in Europe. Perhaps some listeners across the Atlantic won't be aware of this, but there is a very distinct divide in Europe between the beer drinking countries and the wine drinking countries. And it really depends on the climate. So you get places which tend to be wet and grey and often lacking a lot of summer sunshine. Places like, dare I say, Germany, Belgium, Britain, and the culture is for beer. And in this country, until the last couple of 100 years, beer wasn't hopped to make it bitter. It was a very different drink. But we know that beer has been brewed in this country since before the Romans arrived. So it's a very, very long heritage that it's got there.
And here I am complaining about it.
I know. You should think yourself lucky, shouldn't you? Mind you, this is in danger of becoming beer life ghost stories, isn't it? Rather than so we should perhaps move on to some more spooky content again.
Let's go for it.
Well, I'm happy to tell you this is another pub that perhaps we can visit when next time up visiting you, because we're returning back to Kent once more. Our next visit, staying in Kent, and this time having a meal as well as a drink, we are heading to the perfectly picturesque village of Chilham. This might be the absolute archetype of an English village, so much so that it is regularly used as a filming location for just that reason. It boasts a medieval castle, a manor house, and a village square surrounded on all sides by medieval and Tudor wood-framed houses. Like all the best villages, it has not just one, but two lovely pubs, the White Horse and the Woolpack Inn. The village is just a few miles outside the city of Canterbury, and when I lived there, I once walked to the ancient North Downs Way, turning round at Chilham to head back, before setting off again. However, before I decided to head back to Canterbury, it seemed rude not to take advantage of the hospitality of one of the pubs, so I headed into the Woolpack Inn, where water bottle and belly were both filled by the friendly staff, who really could not have been more helpful and welcoming. It seems that being helpful and welcoming is a long tradition at the Woolpack, and this well describes the mood and activities of the pub's longest-serving and most mysterious resident, the Grey Lady. Nobody knows who she is or why she stays at the Woolpack. Although the front of the pub looks distinctly Victorian, nestled as it is in a fork in the road, the oldest parts of it date back to the 15th century, and it is in these oldest parts of the building that the Grey Lady is seen. She is apparently a very pleasant presence, if a trifle alarming for those who encounter her unexpectedly. She wanders the corridors calmly and quietly, smiling at and looking fondly towards those she comes into contact with. It is almost as though she is checking on the rooms and making sure that all the guests are comfortable, and then, once she is satisfied that all is well, she disappears again to repeat her kindly rounds the next day. When I visited the Woolpack, I didn't encounter the Grey Lady, I'm sorry to say, but I can recommend the pub. It's a Shepherd Neame pub, so you'd best like their beers, but I'd recommend a pint of Early Bird if visiting in springtime, a pint of Late Red if visiting in autumn, or a pint of Bishop's Finger at any other time of the year. Best not to ask about that name. The Hanger chips were very reasonably priced, and fuel enough to get me back to Canterbury just before nightfall, and perhaps just before the return of the Grey Lady that evening.
I was in Chilham the other day.
You were? Did you see the Woolpack?
I did not go into the Woolpack, but I was talking to the barman in the White Horse, because the barman in the White Horse used to be the barman in the Unicorn, which is a pub that me and Tim frequented, and I still frequent. And I said, I'll call in and see you soon. I haven't seen you in ages. And how's the new job going? Blah, blah, blah. And he was like, don't bother. You only ever drink lime and soda. So what's the point? And I was like, okay, sorry.
Well, you can give the lie to that now, because you've got proof that you've drunk a beer now.
I've got audio proof. I couldn't think of the word audio there. I've got audio proof that I drank a beer. Well, I've had a couple of mouthfuls of a beer, but still, it's audio proof.
While my back's been turned, you've been tipping it down the sink, haven't you?
Just throwing it over my shoulder, hoping for the best. Chilham is really picturesque. It is almost unreal how picturesque it is and beautiful it is.
It's almost like someone's just created it as a film set, isn't it?
Literally, that is what it feels like when you're there. I've not been in the Woolpack, but I do find it interesting that so many of these pubs have a lady attached to them, whether it's a grey lady, a black lady, a white lady, a lady in red. There's so many of them.
But there's probably a historical reason for it, you know.
Yeah.
So brewing was a woman's profession.
Was it actually?
Back in the day, in medieval times, brewing was very much a woman's possession. So while men were more likely to be tilling the fields and working with the animals and things, the housewife would be brewing as an extra form of income. So what we understand today as a pub there were originally places called alehouses where it wasn't so where you'd necessarily stay for your drink or have a meal or anything, but there might be a woman in the community who had a really good reputation for the quality of her beer. And it would be checked, by the way. There would be sort of government officials who would check this sort of thing and make sure that it was up to scratch. And when they realized, oh, you know what, we can make some more money from this, they would hang a distinctive sign outside their house. And so, yeah, very much a woman's tradition.
Go on, the girls.
There we are. We love a bit of women's history, don't we?
Yeah, we do. That's amazing. I never knew that. I did not know it was traditionally a woman's job. Oh,
Wouldn't that
makes
explain all the
sense.
sightings, though, wouldn't it?
Because, of course, it was hers. It was her empire. It was how you brought money in.
Exactly right. I mean, I think some of these sort of tourist traps, especially in the cities, they go very much down the route of talking about brothels and sex workers and saying, oh, well, we have this ferocious madam who was in charge here. And yeah, there is a certain amount of truth to that in the towns. But actually, it obscures a much more mundane, but I think even more important fact that actually many of these hostelries, because that sort of thing was considered within a woman's sphere, housekeeping, good cooking, good brewing, and being hospitable was seen as part of the woman's role within the household. Even if you weren't a public house, if you were just a private house, that was part of a wife's responsibilities. It explains why we get so many matriarchal characters and, let's face it, matriarchal ghosts and spirits within these places, I think.
Oh my God, I think you've solved a mystery. I think you've solved it, Tim.
We'll get this published, won't we?
Yes. We've solved ghosts. Well, I mean, you have in this episode. I've just been along for the ride.
The less said about the having to share beds and inns, the better.
Yeah, let's not. Yeah.
See, we're learning and we're enjoying ourselves today, aren't we, folks? No, I can't help myself. It's the history teacher in me. I can't not give the lesson when it comes out. I hope people are enjoying it, though. I'm about halfway through my beer, by the way, if you want to just check your levels, because we are heading into our final haunts now. So we need to be ready. You've actually done very well. That's such a patronizing thing to say, but you have. I'm impressed.
I've drank about a third of my beer, just to let everybody know.
You've done very well. I'm going to have a sip now just to get myself ready for the next stories.
To get yourself prepped and primed and ready. I'm enjoying this, and I'm really enjoying the history.
That's good. I hope the listeners are as well. Well, the last place we're going is really famous for a completely different way, and it's also not a place that I've lived. So I doubt either of us have been there, but you might correct me there, given that you do like yourself a bit of literature, don't you?
I do.
All right. Well, let's get into it then. Our final haunts on this paranormal pub crawl are both located in the village of Haworth in West Yorkshire. Today, Haworth is a mecca for literary tourism, being the home of the famous Bronte sisters. It is a charmingly preserved village with steep cobbled streets and handsome buildings constructed from the local sandstone, seeming to cling precariously to the hills. My last visit to Haworth had a rather less artistically justified motive. It was my brother's stag do, or bachelor party. Knowing his love for old steam trains, and also knowing that the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway have a pub carriage on every train, we alighted merrily, or should I say very merrily, at Haworth and ascended the steep slope in search of further refreshment. We stopped at a few pubs that afternoon, but two I later learned had a variety of ghostly activity. The Old White Lion, a hotel in the village, looks much like the other buildings on the steep streets of Haworth. On entering, one is struck by the interior, all false beams and Artex plaster with long red cushioned benches against the walls and a wagon wheel mounting lights in the ceiling. The impression is far more 1970s than 1790s, but it has a charm nonetheless. The bar itself seems reassuringly free of ghostly encounters, but the same cannot be said for one of the rooms in the hotel. The tale goes back to 1906 and a tragic death. That summer, on Saturday the 9th of June, the people of Haworth flocked to the cricket and football fields to see what should have been a death-defying feat of daring. Sadly, that day, Death would not be denied his prize. 3 days earlier, Captain Frederick Bidmead and Miss Lily Cove had checked into the Old White Lion Hotel. Lily had been booked into room 7, and having dropped off their luggage, the pair set about flyering to advertise their big act at the Haworth Gala that weekend. Certainly, this young woman travelling unchaperoned with a somewhat older man was reason enough to get tongues wagging. But the show that they had in mind was even more the talk of the town. When the gala day came, Lily was wearing her trademark frilly bloomers as she climbed smiling and waving into a dangling seat mounted beneath a small hot air balloon. Her trademark act was to ascend as high as possible in the balloon before leaping out and free falling, her skirts and bloomers fluttering as she went. Then, at the last minute, she would pull the ripcord and her parachute would open and she would safely land among the admiring public. Tragically, that summer, her act would go terribly wrong. The exact circumstances will never be known for certain, but still with about 100 feet to fall, Lily Cove seemed to struggle in her harness, and then it became unclipped. She fell with a sickening crump onto the packed cricket field below. It is thought perhaps that she had panicked, thinking that she was about to end up in the lake where, as a non-swimmer wearing a heavy parachute, she would have likely drowned. Lily Cove's broken body showed some weak signs of life, and she was quickly hurried back to the hotel for the village surgeon to attend to, but nothing could be done. She died on the bed of room 7. She was just 21 years of age. Whether she was a pioneering and liberated woman before her time, or an exploited and vulnerable accomplice of Captain Bidmead, leaves historians divided, but apparently she is reluctant to leave the old White Lion. Guests in room 7 report feeling the mattress of their bed sink down as if someone is sitting on it. Another guest swore blind that he could see the face of a young woman staring at him from the shadows. Initially frozen in terror, he eventually pulled the covers over his face until, as happens so often, he somehow fell asleep again. Staff and guests alike report seeing objects move or seeing Lily's apparition in the corner of their eye. Others report nightmares with a particular theme, the theme of falling, not knowing beforehand the manner of poor Lily's death. Perhaps it is the violent and unexpected nature of her sad demise that makes her hang around this pub too. So that's our first of 2 Haworth stories, the tragic story of Lily Cove and the fact that she refuses to leave room 7.
Can you blame her, really?
Not at all.
Can you blame her? No, I've never been there.
Have you not?
No, I've never been there. My dad is a Yorkshire man, but I have never been to Haworth, and I am not a fan of the Brontes.
Well, there you go.
There's a little factoid for you.
They are a bit involved in the next story. Do you want me to just skip it?
No, you can. It's not that I don't like them as people. I'm sure they were great, and I'm all for pioneering female authors. But they're just that style of literature doesn't do it for me.
Yeah, it's not your thing. Mind you, I bet there's loads of listeners who love them.
Oh my God, definitely. There's loads of listeners who will absolutely love them, and rightly so. Very talented writers, all of that jazz. Just not my vibe. However, I just don't quite know what to make of this story. I just did not imagine that we were going to go down the era of balloons and stunt women.
No, nor did I, until I was looking up these stories. I discovered this story originally well after I'd done that. I often, if I go visit a new place, when I'm bored on the train and I've got nothing else to do, I'll just start researching stories on my way home. And that's when I first heard this story of Lily Cove and the parachute accident. The thing that really got me with these stories, though, is so much of it is like 1,000 other mini episode stories that you've done, with the feeling of the bed sinking down.
Yes.
Or the corner of the ice phenomenon going on. The one that gets me is the dreams about falling, because I think we've all had those. But when you realize that there's a real specific link with that room and that location and someone dying in that way, it just lends so much more power to it, I think.
Definitely. And I think that the energy, I don't know, exerted by a death like that, the really awful thing is that she would have known what was coming.
Absolutely. Yeah.
She would have known that this was the end, and I know that when you're falling, obviously a million things can happen before you hit the ground. I understand all of that, but she would have known. And
she didn't die in the field. She died in that room. She managed to make it back that far. And I think this Captain Bidmead character, he's a very suspicious sort of fella. By the standards of the time, it would have been quite scandalous for him to be traveling around traveling around the country, with an unaccompanied woman. I think the beer's kicking in. There were certain eyebrows raised at that. But then on the other hand, for every account that you read about that, there's very much a sense that she's going, well, okay, yes, I need his connections for me to get these shows. But ultimately, I'm doing what I want to do because I'm a kick-ass, pioneering stunt woman. And that's how I'm going to make my money. It's
tricky, isn't it? Because there's an element of that, of course. And you can imagine that she's like, listen, because she was from a poor area, and you'd be thinking, I can make money doing this. And I know it's risky, but a lot of people love risk and adrenaline and all that stuff. But also how much of it was him going, yeah, go on. Yeah, definitely. This is really empowering for you and it's making me loads of money.
Yeah. And she's 21. She's
And
so young.
21 and, you know, I have a thing open here because I was looking him up while you were talking about him, this Captain Bidmead man. And, you know, there's the conversation to be had about, you know, more spectators would have wanted to see a woman going up rather than a man.
There's that the whole trademark act with the bloomers fluttering in the breeze as she falls and things. It would have been very titillating for the time, wouldn't it? Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Have you got a picture of her there? Because she's a pretty remarkable looking woman, really.
Have I got a pic? I've got lots of pictures of him. Hang on.
Oh, yeah, that sounds about right, doesn't it?
Yeah. So in an article that is about her demise, the first pictures are pictures of him. I have got a picture of her. She is a remarkable looking
really
woman.
striking, isn't she?
Yes, she is, and she looks very strong and self-assured in the picture that I'm looking at her in.
Such strong features to her, isn't there?
Yeah.
So it's pictures like that, although they're posed, they sort of suggest to me that she may have been quite a feisty and formidable character. But of course, it could just be an act as well. We'll never know.
And I know that there is an element of like titillation, like you said, with the bloomers and the ribbon and all of that jazz. And she obviously can't do it in a skirt because that's not safe.
Yeah.
But also for her, in an age where women were meant to be so repressed and covered all the time, and your sexuality was this little gem that you had to look after, and blah blah blah. To be able to be like, I'm going to take my skirt off, I'm going to be in my bloomers, and I'm going to, you know, do this crazy stunt.
Let me get into my underwear and my parachute, and I'll wave goodbye to you as I float up into the air. Because she'd done it plenty of times before then. It's not some sort of one-off, and it's probably been tragedy. She'd done it loads of times. She was really well known for it. So quite a random one, that, isn't it? But you didn't expect
really
that at all.
No, I didn't. And I do think it's interesting that people have these dreams of falling.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you must have had a dream like that before.
Yeah, of course. And you jerk awake and you're like, oh, that was weird.
But these seem to be much more almost like a narrative of, I am falling from a height here, rather than a exploding head syndrome or jolting yourself awake like you do sometimes. It's really interesting. And it's the fact that so many people are reporting it in this specific room.
And I'm sure I have had specific dreams of falling, but I couldn't, if you give me £1 million now, I couldn't tell you the narrative of one.
No,
I don't remember them. I remember the feeling of, you know, jolting awake, but other than that, I don't remember anything else about them.
You're probably a far bigger expert than me. I say probably. You're definitely a far bigger expert than me. But maybe someone who's listening who knows the science behind this, or maybe there's some sort of paranormal explanation for what might bring on an encounter or a memory of this nature. I really don't know. Do you want to pop down the road to the last pub now?
Yes, last pub. I'm ready.
So when I say pop down the road, I really do mean pop down the same road, right next to the White Lion Hotel, or the old White Lion, I should say. So literally just a few yards down the road from the old White Lion is our final pub of this episode, which I'm sure everyone agrees has gone on long enough. The King's Arms is the name of this pub. Immediately next to St. Michael and All Angels Church and the parsonage home of Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, the King's Arms was known to be frequented by the sisters' bright but troubled brother, Bramwell, though he is said to haunt the Black Bull down the road. After all, we all have our favourite pubs, even in the afterlife. The picture postcard streets of Haworth were not always quite so charming. In 1850, Patrick Bronte, parson of the church and father to the literary family, invited scientist and politician Benjamin Babbage to Haworth. His motivation was simple, yet heartbreaking. He was tired of leading the funeral services for so many of Haworth's young people, many of whom died before they were 6 years old. The life expectancy in Haworth at the time was a mere 26 years of age, and all but one of Patrick Bronte's children died before the age of 31, including Emily, Anne, and Bramwell. What Babbage discovered horrified him. Haworth's precipitous streets ran slick with human excrement and blood from the slaughterhouse behind the King's Arms pub. The foul air hung about the town with barely a breeze to move it. At this time, miasma, or bad air, was thought to be the cause of disease, but now we understand differently. As the death rate soared, the graveyard overflowed, and the putrefying remains seeped into the town water supply. corrupting it. Babbage's report would eventually lead to improvements, but not soon enough to prevent Emily, Anne, and Branwell Bronte succumbing to disease. It is this age of filth and early death that brings out the ghostly association with the King's Arms. Being right next to the church, it was also immediate neighbours with the town mortuary. All too often, the mortuary was overflowing with the dead, so some bodies had to be brought into the cellar of the King's Arms for temporary storage. The cold that kept the beer a pleasant temperature helped buy some time to bury the dead before decomposition set in. Think of that next time you sip your pint. As a result, the pub is said to be filled with unexplained phenomena. While few can be specific, most seem to be poltergeist activity, and most of it happens in the cellar. Staff working to change barrels find taps knocked to the floor and mallets tossed aside. Others see shadows or hear whispers in the dark. In the dead of night, when the pub is shut, loud bangs and heavy footsteps emanate from the cellar door, and yet nobody is there when a brave barkeep goes to look. Perhaps strangest of all are the objects that go missing from the guest rooms, only for them to reappear in the strangest of places, including down in the cellar. Perhaps the King's Arms, Haworth, still echoes with the lost souls of the unfortunate victims of the village's unsanitary past. A cleansing of a different sort may now be needed. For all this, though, the pub itself has a very pleasant atmosphere, crowded with pretty paintings and comfy chairs. My recommendation? A pint of Timothy Taylor's Boltmaker Ale, to wash down the steak and kidney pie. Just be sure that your beer is mortuary cold when it's served.
I'd love a steak and kidney pie right now.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, I'd love one. It is amazing, the shocking past that a lot of these pubs have. And you think about the amount of people that go into these pubs for a casual drink, cozy drink, and they're like, oh, isn't this lovely? Isn't this great? And they have no idea that, years ago, this place was a literal cesspit.
It's
do you know what I mean?
Absolutely shocking. And like you said earlier about did people really drink more beer back then because the water was dangerous? Well, this is one of these 19th century Industrial Revolution cases where, yes, that is absolutely the case. But they didn't know that it was carried in the water. And it was years before that was accepted. It was actually in London. It was a man called Dr. John Snow did a bit of sort of investigative journalism of going around the towns of the Broad Street cholera outbreak, which is probably not really one for a Ghost Stories podcast, but it's fascinating to know that what he noticed was that people who were drinking from the well were dying, and they were absolutely dying in their droves. And then pretty much immediately next to this well or pump that people were dying from was a brewery, and the brewery workers all drank beer and they were all surviving. The workhouse down the road, they were drinking from their own private well and they were all surviving, and yet they were all breathing the same air. So clearly the problem was the water and not the air. And of course, the real kicker in this one was there was a woman who died in Hampstead, which was a good few miles away from Broad Street. Turned out every morning she got a bottle of that water brought up because she liked the taste. And I shudder to think of what was giving the distinctive taste to that water.
Oh, that gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Doesn't it just? Sometimes history's way more scary than ghosts, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Like 100%, without any doubt, history and humans and real life is way more scary than ghosts.
At least here they did get it sorted. But a lot of people had to die first.
That's true, but that's the reality, is that in order to get it sorted, lots of people die first, and then they go, oh, hang on a second. Hang on, something's happening here. Something's not right, and we need to figure out how to fix this.
I said this to Sinead and Nick on the Poisonous Cabinet just the other day. All the time, kids ask me at work, say, so if you could live at any time in history, when would it be? And most of the time, my answer is very simply, well, right now. For all the things that are wrong with the world, for all the many things that upset me about how the world is today, it would have been so much more miserable at virtually any other time in the past. And I think that's really worth remembering. We are all the products of a lot of people, some of whom were brave, some of whom were cowards, but all of whom ultimately survived long enough for us to be here today. And we owe them at least that, don't we?
Oh, that's.
I think I might raise a glass to them. How about yourself?
Let's raise a glass. I'm still on the third of my pint drank, but I'm raising a glass to all the people that have gone before, both brave and stupid.
Well, that was my last pub story, and I really hope everyone enjoyed them. I know this has been a longer episode than you normally do, but it tends to be when we're on Patreon, we've got that little bit more freedom to kind of go off on tangents and things, so I hope people haven't minded that. But of course, this is technically the second in a 3-part series, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So 2 weeks ago, we did an episode on village churches. And this week's was obviously village pubs. And what's the next installment for Patreon?
Well, it's going to be called To the Manor Born and Died. It's going to be Ghosts of Grand English Houses. So that's what we're going to conclude with. But even if the only episode people listen to is this one here, you can count this as my little personal love letter to the English village, because I think there are so many fascinating and wonderful stories about them. And is it any wonder that so many of them are so desperately, desperately haunted?
With all that history, babe, absolutely not. It is no wonder.
And I think we've maybe mapped out a day out for ourselves next time I come up and visit.
Yes, we have. I think we should walk or run, whichever, which I know that you're still injured. When you're feeling up to it, run to Chilham.
We'll do that.
Have a pint and some ham, egg and chips.
At the Woolpack.
Run back to Canterbury day one. And
Wave
then
to the Grey Lady before we go.
Yes. And then Faversham.
Absolutely ideal. And in fact, I had my first run in 3 months this week.
Oh, well done. He's back, baby.
I'm back. I mean, this is not going to mean a lot to so many listeners, but yeah, I had a nasty back injury. Actually, it might mean something to some of them because you did mention the fact that Lily, my cat, sat on my lap when I was badly injured, and that's what it was.
Yes.
It was a back injury. I'm a bit disappointed in Lily. Actually, I was hoping that my own personal pub cat was going to make an appearance in this episode, and I've had some food. I'm going to go and sleep on the sofa.
She's a cat. She knows. She's like,
she knows
I'm not
what she's
doing what you want me to do. Don't be ridiculous.
She wouldn't shut up last episode, though, would she?
No, she was meowing the whole last episode. This time she's like, you want me there? No, absolutely not.
In fact, before we press record, we did discuss that there's a pecking order here, isn't there? And
yes.
Lily is very much the most popular out of all three of us, I think, for people who know her.
She absolutely is. Tim, where can people find you?
Well, if they're not going to find me in a lovely country pub down here in Devon, they can find me online at Mr. Cloak History, which is my YouTube channel. I made this as a way of delivering lessons in lockdown, but my revision videos I've made for British history exams, many of which are actually on American topics as it happens, apparently make a rather nice podcast too. So although I didn't make it for that, go and check it out. You might enjoy it and hopefully you'll learn something as well. Alternatively, you can find some of my whiteboard drawings from my classroom at Dry Wipe History on Instagram as well. And just finally, thank you very much for letting me do yet another episode, Emma. I feel genuinely kind of honoured to be on a main episode, following the footsteps of many much bigger, brighter names than my own. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed it.
It's been an absolute joy to have you, Tim. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for listening. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content and more extra content with our lovely Tim, as we said, there's like 11 or 12 episodes, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Cheers, dears.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.